So we continue to read from the letter to the Hebrews. We are in chapter 6. Today we're starting with verse 10. But I think it's good to go back to the first verse or first couple of verses of chapter 6. The author of the letter to the Hebrews states that he is writing to people who are mature, and so there is no need to go back and recreate the foundation. In other words, he's not covering the basics with us here. He's speaking to people who already have a pretty good knowledge of their faith. And so we start in verse 10 here. God is not so unjust as to overlook your work and the love you have demonstrated. We earnestly desire each of you to demonstrate that same eagerness for the fulfillment of hope until the end. Now remember, he's writing to people who have journeyed a long way in faith, and maybe their hope is starting to flag. Maybe their faith is starting to weaken, or they're getting lost. Because the next thing he says here, so that you may not become sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience are inheriting the promises. Now he's going to go through these promises. Where we're going with this, and this is important, is the author says, this is in the last verse or two, he says, this we have as an anchor of the soul. We have an anchor for our soul. So in times of pandemic, in times of political disruption, in times of economic difficulties, we have an anchor for the soul, sure and firm. And we're going to find out he's referring to Jesus here. But he goes back to what foreshadows Jesus. When God made the promise to Abraham, and by the way, when God makes a promise, it's an oath. Because he's got no one more higher to make an oath. All right? An oath is how you enter into a covenant relationship. So when God made the promise to Abraham, he promised that his descendants would be more numerous than the stars of the sky, and that all people would be blessed through him. That's God's promise. Since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself. This, by the way, is how we take a promise and make it an oath. If you go into a courtroom and they need to know that you're going to tell the truth, you put your hand on the Bible, you raise your hand, and you say, I swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God. And people say, now we know that you're going to tell the truth. Because if you lie under oath, the civil penalty is you go to jail. The divine penalty is you've just asked that all of the curses in the good book come down upon your head. Not something that you want. All right? So, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself and said, I will indeed bless you and multiply you. First time God says that, Abraham has no kids. And the second time he says that, he's got one kid. And he's like 90 years old, and Sarah is 80 years old. So it's important. Abraham has been walking with the Lord. He's been following God. But every now and then, his faith starts to weaken. He goes into Egypt, and he tells everybody that Sarah's his sister because he's afraid. Not good to sell your wife off to somebody else. But God knows. And so God cares for him. Now, men swear by someone greater than themselves for an oath to serve as a guarantee. Abraham and God, or I should say, God makes an oath to Abraham really 3 times. I think it's Genesis 10, 12 and 15. In chapter 15, God tells Abraham to split some animals in two, to cut them in half and put them off to the side, and some birds, but don't cut them. And then Abraham sits down and he waits. And when night comes, the Lord passes through those animals. By the way, if you're doing the Bible in a Year podcast, which we're really encouraging people, what I'm saying now is from day 6 and day 7. So even if you don't do the whole year, the Bible in a Year podcast, if you know how to get a podcast, go to the Bible in a Year podcast, go to day 6 and day 7. The podcast is about 20 minutes. I highly recommend it. So, Abraham splits the animals, and the Lord moves through them. Abraham doesn't, which is interesting, because this was one of the ways you could take an oath. You would split the animals, and by walking through them, you would say, if I am lying, may I be split like the animals. It's an interesting way to make a covenant, because God goes through the animals, Abraham doesn't. It's almost as if God says, I know that you're weak, and I know that you can't do this. I'll do it for you. And so God makes an oath. It is a guarantee. So when God wanted to give the heirs of his promise, the Jews, all right, when God wanted to give the heirs of his promise an even clearer demonstration of the immutability of his purpose, he intervened with an oath, so that the two immutable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have taken refuge might be strongly encouraged and hold fast to the hope that lies before us. Another way to take an oath in biblical times was to say, Amen. St. Paul refers to Jesus as the great Amen. Abraham split the animals. God walked through. Abraham didn't. In Jesus, we have God made man taking the oath for us so that we can be part of this covenant relationship with God, so that we can be God's family, so that we can be heirs of his promise. That's God's plan. And if our hope, you know, when he's, the letters written to people who are mature, I'm mature and I don't have the same stamina that I used to. When our physical stamina isn't there, sometimes our faith and our hope are also weakened. And so God tells us that he has taken this oath for us, and we can take refuge in him so that we might be strongly encouraged and hold fast to the hope that lies before us. And this is what he refers to as, he says, this we have as an anchor for the soul, sure and firm. We could not enter behind the veil. That veil is what takes you into the Holy of Holies. In the Jewish temple, you had the section for the Gentiles. Then, I think they had a section for women. But then they had the holy section, all right, where the Jews could come and pray. But inside of that, they had the Holy of Holies, which contained the Ark of God, the mercy seat, the propitiatory. And the high priest, he could go in only once a year. Jesus, we've been saying the last couple of days, Jesus is the great high priest. And so he enters behind the veil for us. But He is the forerunner. God's plan for us is that we should all be with him in heaven. When there'll be no need of a veil, we will be with God and we will see him face to face. So that is the anchor of our soul. Reflect on that today. God's covenant is the anchor of our soul. We can trust him. And Jesus was the great Amen, the oath for us. We can trust in him, and that is an anchor for our souls.